said, this conference is intended to open a conversation. We're really interested in laying the foundation for work of the next 4 years. But to do that, we wanted to take a step back and give you a bit of a sense of how we got here, what it was that we've been thinking about that led us to a conference on knowledge infrastructure and to the idea of knowledge infrastructure in the first place. And for us, it really starts with a book that was written in 2003 by Hernando de Soto. He wrote a book called The Mystery of Capital. And in that book, he is attempting to explain why capitalism works in the West, but nowhere else. And he points to something a little unexpected in that book. He writes about the notion of a land registry. The idea that with a land registry, we can, as individuals and business leaders, have confidence in our ability to invest in our land and in the physical spaces around us. And without clear property rights, we won't do that. And in fact, without clear property rights, banks can't loan us capital, which dramatically reduces the total amount of capital that is available in the world to be spent on business innovation. So this idea of a bunch of infrastructure, little considered elements of rules and systems that sit underneath our shared society was really intriguing to us, and in particular started Roger down an interesting path.
Yeah, the book came out in 2003. In the same year, I wrote an HBR article called Virtue Matrix that came out of a conversation that Mike Feinberg, who you'll hear from later, and I and others had at the Austen Institute. And in it, I posited the notion that a society has underneath it a civil foundation, a set of rules, norms, behaviors that either make it a better place or a worse place for everybody to live in. And when De Soto's book came out, around the same time, I remember being struck and said, wow, I would have never thought of land registry systems as fundamental to capitalism. But of course, it's a piece of the civil foundation of a society. And in the article, I argued, and I still maintain this, which is the civil foundation of any society is not fixed. It can be either ratcheted up by the behaviors of people, organizations, governments, or it could be undermined. I mean, that's why, in 2000, lead up to 2008-9, there were a bunch of folks in the financial sector who were arguably undermining the foundation we had in that structure, and we had to get it back on the rails, as Tiff said. So it got me thinking more broadly about infrastructure and saying, might there be a particular set of structures and norms and systems underneath our society that make a difference, a huge difference in how democratic capitalism functions, and shouldn't we think more systematically about it?
So we went out and talked to folks, and some of the folks we talked to are actually in the room today. We wanted to think about infrastructure. What are its forms? How should we be thinking about infrastructure as a foundational tool that we could use to improve our knowledge base? And we really thought about 3 forms of infrastructure. There are many, but the 3 that we're most interested in are physical, transactional, and knowledge. So physical infrastructure is the infrastructure we all know about and are used to. It is this building, right? It is the roads. It is our sewage systems. It is all the set of physical elements that let us live together. And of course, physical infrastructure has existed since we started living together in community groups. So it is our shared public goods. But there's also a slightly more abstract form of infrastructure, and that is transactional infrastructure. So these are the rules and norms and systems that let us engage in commerce, that let us be governed by political systems. They are the way in which we create systems of exchange. And we're very interested in that. Roger wrote a book about the capital markets called Fixing the Game. It started down the path of how we think about our transactional infrastructure and what it does for us and the way in which it is being gamed. But what we're talking about today is knowledge infrastructure. And that is the whole set of systems, norms, and structures that let us create, build, and exchange ideas. And we thought that it would be really interesting to take a step back and focus on that today. How do we transfer information from person to person? What does that look like?
And I hadn't seen it before, but we now have this highly complex, surprisingly high plus over academics, right? So highly complex And I think one of the more interesting things about knowledge, at least to me, is it's traditionally thought about as something we have in our heads, and yet it's highly woven into all of our physical and transactional systems that we are in the background, and I think we're not often even aware to what extent what we think is influenced by things we don't imagine to be in our heads. And so that relationship is something I think we want to explore today and take some extra time, because it hasn't been something actively explored in a knowledge atmosphere. We usually think about writing papers, and we think about building on our own ideas and publishing ideas, but it's connected to a much wider system of influences.